They handed her a cardboard box and walked her to the door like she was a criminal. No goodbye. No thank you. Just silence and security escorts. 12 hours earlier, Rachel Donovan had been elbow deep in a dying Marine's chest cavity, pulling out bullet fragments one by one while half the surgical staff stood frozen. She saved that man's life. She did what 6 years as a combat medic had trained her to do, act when everyone else hesitates. But the hospital didn't see a hero. They saw a liability. So they let her go. Rachel drove home in the dark, sat on the edge of her bed, and stared at the wall. She thought it was over. She thought she'd lost everything. But the next morning, 3 black SUVs pulled up outside her apartment. And the man she saved stepped out, in full uniform, with a general standing right beside him. Good day and welcome back to this channel. Before we dive into today's story, do us a quick favor. Drop a comment and let us know where in the world you're watching from. We love seeing just how far these stories travel, and honestly, it blows our minds every single time. All right, settle in, because today's story, it's going to hit different.
Stop her now.
You might lose your job. We need proper clearance before we can do anything. You broke protocol, you deserve to go.
The rain came down in thin, steady lines against the kitchen window. Not the kind of rain that demands attention, the quiet kind. The kind that settles over a city like a whisper nobody asked for. And Rachel Donovan stood at her kitchen counter watching it fall, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee she hadn't taken a single sip from. It was almost midnight. The apartment was small. Clean, but small. 1 bedroom. A narrow hallway. A living room that doubled as everything else. The kind of place that tells you a person lives alone and has for a while. Not because they can't afford more, but because they've stopped expecting anyone to share it with. On the shelf near the window sat a folded American flag, tucked into a triangular display case. The glass was spotless. She cleaned it every Sunday. Next to it, pinned to a corkboard on the wall, was a faded combat medic patch. The kind that gets sewn onto the shoulder of someone who runs toward gunfire while everyone else runs the other way. And just beneath it, lying face down on the shelf, was a photograph. She never turned it over anymore. She used to. Late at night, when the silence got too thick and the memories pushed through whether she wanted them to or not. She'd pick it up, look at the faces, her unit, her people, the ones she'd bled beside in places most Americans couldn't point to on a map. But looking at that photo always led to the same face. And that face always led to the same memory. So she stopped. Some things are easier to carry when you don't look at them directly. Rachel set the coffee down and pressed her palms flat against the counter. The rain kept falling. The clock on the microwave blinked 11:47 p.m. And for a moment, the apartment was so quiet she could hear her own breathing. Then her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. Shift alert. Staffing short at Mercy Lane General. Immediate coverage needed. She didn't sigh. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed her jacket off the back of the chair, slipped on her shoes, and walked out the door before the coffee had time to go cold. That was Rachel. When the call came, she showed up. It didn't matter if she was tired. It didn't matter if the world outside was dark and wet and unwelcoming. Showing up was the only thing she'd never failed at. It was the one thing nobody could take from her. Or so she thought. Across town, Mercy Lane General Hospital hummed with the low, constant energy of a building that never sleeps. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like trapped insects. The hallways smelled of antiseptic and burnt coffee. Somewhere down the east wing, a monitor beeped in steady rhythm, keeping time for a patient who had no idea anyone was listening. Dr. Owen Bradford sat alone in the break room. He was still in his scrubs, a surgical cap hanging loose around his neck, his eyes scanning a stack of patient charts he'd already reviewed twice. He rubbed the bridge of his nose, exhaled slowly, and flipped to the next page like a man looking for something he knew he wouldn't find. Owen was the kind of doctor every hospital wanted and no one truly knew. His hands were steady. His decisions were sharp. In the OR, he moved with the kind of precision that made younger residents stop and watch. He had a reputation, not for warmth, not for charm, but for being right when it mattered most. But outside the operating room, Owen was a ghost. He ate lunch alone. He stayed late not because he had to, but because going home meant sitting in a house that echoed. He kept his personal life sealed behind a door he never opened in conversation, and anyone who knocked learned quickly that he wasn't answering. A nurse named Jenna walked into the break room and leaned against the counter. "You're still here? Owen, your shift ended 2 hours ago." He didn't look up. "I'm reviewing charts." "You were reviewing charts 3 hours ago. Then I must really like charts." Jenna studied him for a second, the kind of look a person gives when they want to say something real but know it won't be received. She shook her head lightly and left. Owen sat there a moment longer. Then he closed the chart, leaned back, and stared at the ceiling. The fluorescent light flickered once. He blinked. He had no one to go home to, and the hospital, at least, had the decency not to remind him. The front doors hissed open as Rachel walked in. Her jacket was damp from the rain. She signed in at the nurse's station, clipped her badge to her chest, and made her way down the hallway with the kind of calm that only people who've seen worse can carry. She passed Owen near the vending machines. Their eyes met briefly, a professional nod, nothing more. Two people sharing the same building, the same exhaustion, the same silence. But as Rachel turned the corner, Owen glanced back. Just for a second. He didn't know why. Something about the way she moved, steady, deliberate, like a woman who had already survived the hardest thing she'd ever face and wasn't afraid of anything this hospital could throw at her. He turned back to his charts. She disappeared down the hall. Neither of them knew it yet. But that small, forgettable moment, that half-second glance in a fluorescent hallway at 10 minutes past midnight, was the beginning of everything. Have you ever had a moment where just showing up changed everything? Not just for someone else, but for you? Think about that, and let us know in the comments. Rachel had barely finished reviewing the board when the shift charge nurse came around the corner fast. Not running, but fast enough that everyone noticed. "We just got a call. Critical inbound. Military escort. ETA 8 minutes. The air in the ER shifted. Nurses straightened. Monitors were checked. Someone called down to radiology. The hum of the hospital, that constant, drowsy rhythm, cracked open, and something sharper took its place. Rachel looked toward the ambulance bay doors. She didn't know what was coming, but something deep in her chest did. Something old. Something trained into her bones in places where the sand burned and the sky offered no shade, and the only thing standing between a Marine and death was someone willing to act. She straightened her badge, and she waited. The ambulance bay doors hadn't even opened yet, and already the energy was different. Two black SUVs pulled into the hospital parking lot first. Military plates, tinted windows. Armed personnel stepped out before the vehicles had fully stopped, taking positions near the entrance like sentries guarding a gate. One of them spoke into a radio clipped to his shoulder. His voice was low, clipped, the kind of voice that doesn't repeat itself. Then the ambulance came. No sirens. Just flashing lights cutting through the rain like something out of a nightmare you can't wake up from. It backed into the bay with precision, and before the rear doors swung open, every nurse, every technician, every set of eyes in that emergency room was already locked in. They wheeled him in fast. Staff Sergeant Caleb Mercer, 29 years old, 6'1", built like a man who'd spent his adult life running toward the things most people run from. But tonight, he didn't look like a warrior. He looked like what war leaves behind. His body was torn apart. Bullet fragments, more than anyone could count at a glance, were embedded across his torso, his arms, his abdomen. His fatigues had been cut away, replaced with blood-soaked field dressings applied somewhere between the battlefield and the back of a transport plane. His skin was pale. His vitals were dropping. The monitors attached to him beeped with the kind of rhythm that tells a trained ear the clock is running out. A soldier walking beside the gurney handed a sealed folder to the charge nurse. Classified operation. Ambush. He took fire covering his team's extraction. He's been in transit for 11 hours. The charge nurse opened the folder, scanned the top page, and looked up at the soldier with something between disbelief and dread. 50+ embedded fragments. The soldier nodded once. At least. They moved him into Trauma Bay 1. The senior attending, Dr. Leland Cross, a man with 30 years of experience and the cautious instincts to match, studied the scans as they came through. He tilted the screen. He zoomed in. He tilted it again. Then he stepped back and shook his head. There's too many. They're too deep. If we go in aggressively, we risk catastrophic hemorrhaging. We stabilize, manage the bleed, and reassess in the morning. A few nurses nodded. One stepped back from the table entirely, arms folded, eyes low. The room settled into a kind of medical silence, the kind that means everyone agrees the situation is beyond saving. Everyone except Rachel. She stood near the secondary monitor, her eyes fixed on the imaging scans. She hadn't said a word since Caleb was wheeled in, but her jaw was tight. Her fingers were still, and behind her eyes, something was turning. Something that had nothing to do with hospital protocol and everything to do with a life she'd lived before this one. She'd seen this before. Not on a screen, not in a textbook, in the sand. In the back of a shaking armored vehicle with dust in her teeth and blood on her hands, and a Marine gasping underneath her while gunfire cracked overhead. She'd seen bodies worse than this one survive, not because of luck, but because someone in the room decided that giving up wasn't an option. Rachel looked at the scans one more time. Then she spoke. He's got a chance. The room went quiet. Dr. Cross turned to her slowly. Nurse Donovan, the fragmentation pattern alone. I've seen worse. Her voice wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive. It was steady the way a bridge is steady, built to hold weight. The fragments near the aorta are superficial. The cluster in the lower abdomen is accessible if we go in lateral. The bleed is controlled enough to buy us time, but only if we move now. If we wait until morning, we lose him. Nobody moved. Then a voice came from the doorway. She's right. Owen Bradford stood at the entrance of Trauma Bay 1. His coat was on. His bag was over his shoulder. He'd been halfway to the parking lot when the call came through on the overhead speaker. He'd almost kept walking. Almost. He set his bag down, walked to the monitor, studied the scans with the focus of a man who had spent his entire career learning how to read what others couldn't. He traced the fragment pattern with his finger. He looked at the bleed rate. He looked at the clock. Then he looked at Rachel. She didn't flinch. She didn't plead. She just held his gaze the way someone does when they've already made their decision and they're waiting for you to make yours. Owen turned to the room. We're going in. Full surgical team. I need 2 units of ONEG on standby, and someone get me a micro-extraction kit. Now. The room erupted into motion. Rachel scrubbed in without being asked. She took her place across the table from Owen, gloved hands steady, eyes sharp. And for the next 6 hours, they worked. They didn't speak much. There was no need. Owen's hands moved with the precision of a man who had trained his whole life to cut exactly where it mattered. Rachel guided him, not with authority, but with instinct. She anticipated his needs before he voiced them. She flagged fragment positions from memory of the scans. She called out pressure changes a full second before the monitors caught up. 1 fragment, then 5, then 15, then 30. The clock moved. The rain kept falling outside. And inside Trauma Bay 1, 2 people who barely knew each other moved like they'd been doing this together for years. By the time the sun crept through the narrow window above the scrub station, it was over. 53 fragments. All removed. Caleb Mercer's vitals held. His heart rate steadied. The monitors beeped in a rhythm that no longer sounded like a countdown. It sounded like a promise. Owen set down the last instrument and stood still. His hands were trembling, not from exhaustion, but from the quiet shock of realizing what they'd just done. He looked across the table at Rachel. She looked back. Neither of them said a word. But something passed between them in that silence. Something heavier than gratitude. Something deeper than respect. It was the kind of recognition that happens when 2 people meet each other in the exact place where their broken pieces fit. The monitors beeped. The sun rose. And Caleb Mercer was alive. By 7 in the morning, every floor of Mercy Lane General had heard the story. Not the full story. Never the full story. Hospitals don't deal in full stories. They deal in whispers. Half-truths traded between shift changes. Fragments passed over coffee cups and clipboard handoffs, like currency no one wants to be caught spending. But the whispers were everywhere. 53 bullet fragments. They said he wasn't going to make it. She was the one who pushed for it, the nurse. The one who used to be military. Owen Bradford stayed. He almost left, and he stayed. Have you seen the patient? He's still breathing. Barely, but breathing. By the time the day shift clocked in, Caleb Mercer had become the ghost story every hospital keeps. The patient who wasn't supposed to survive the night, but somehow did. His vitals were fragile. His body was wrecked. But his heart was beating with the stubborn rhythm of a man who wasn't done yet. And Rachel Donovan. The woman who had stood over him for 6 hours and refused to let him go sat alone in the break room with her hands wrapped around a paper cup of water she hadn't touched. She was exhausted. The kind of exhaustion that lives in your bones, not your muscles. The kind you don't fix with sleep because it isn't really about being tired. It's about having given everything you had and sitting in the strange, hollow quiet that follows. But underneath the exhaustion, there was something else. Relief. Not the loud kind. Not the kind that makes you smile or cry or call someone to celebrate. The quiet kind. The kind that sits in your chest like a warm stone and reminds you that what you did mattered. That the training, the sacrifice, the years of carrying wounds nobody else could see, they added up to something tonight. A man was alive because she showed up. Rachel closed her eyes. Just for a moment. Then the break room door opened. Patricia Holloway walked in the way a cold front moves through a room. Sharp, composed, and impossible to ignore. She was the hospital's chief administrator, a woman who had built her career not on medicine, but on management. She wore a fitted charcoal blazer over a pressed blouse, her hair pulled back tight enough to smooth every possible imperfection. Her heels clicked against the tile floor with a rhythm that sounded less like walking and more like counting down. She didn't sit. She stood across from Rachel with a manila folder in her hand and a look on her face that had nothing to do with congratulations. Nurse Donovan. Rachel opened her eyes. Ms. Holloway, I've been reviewing the surgical logs from last night. Patricia opened the folder. Her eyes scanned the page the way a lawyer scans a contract, looking for the line that ends someone. Who authorized your participation in that procedure? Rachel sat up straighter. Dr. Bradford called the surgery. I was already on the floor. I scrubbed in to assist based on my trauma training and... Your trauma training. Patricia repeated the words like they left a bad taste in her mouth. You're a registered nurse, Ms. Donovan. Not a surgeon. Not a surgical assistant. You are not credentialed to participate in a procedure of that magnitude in this facility. The patient was dying. The patient is still critical. And the fact that he survived does not retroactively authorize what happened in that operating room. Rachel held her gaze. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't look away. But something behind her eyes shifted, the first crack in the calm she'd been carrying since the ambulance bay doors swung open. I did what needed to be done. Patricia closed the folder. That's not your decision to make. She turned and left without another word. 20 minutes later, Patricia sat behind her desk on the 4th floor with Owen Bradford across from her. The office was pristine, glass awards on the shelf, framed certificates on the wall, a desk so clean it looked like it had never seen actual work. Everything in the room was arranged to communicate one thing: control. Owen sat with his hands resting on the arms of the chair. His face was unreadable, but his jaw was tight. Dr. Bradford, I want to be very clear about something. Patricia leaned forward slightly. This hospital has protocols for a reason. What happened last night, regardless of the outcome, represents a significant liability exposure. A nurse with no surgical clearance participated in a 6-hour operation on a high-profile military patient. If anything had gone wrong, nothing went wrong. If anything had gone wrong, Patricia continued, as if he hadn't spoken, this hospital would be facing a lawsuit, a federal review, and a media disaster. You understand that? Owen was quiet for a moment. He looked at the window behind Patricia's head. The rain had stopped, but the sky was still gray, like the morning couldn't decide what it wanted to be. She knew what she was doing, Owen said carefully. Her trauma background. Her background is irrelevant. Her credentials are what matter. And her credentials do not include surgical participation at this facility. Patricia straightened a pen on her desk that was already perfectly straight. I need to know that you understand the position this puts the hospital in. Owen met her eyes. There was a war happening behind his, the kind that doesn't make noise. He wanted to say more. He wanted to say that Rachel hadn't just assisted, she had guided. That without her instinct, her calm, her knowledge of combat injuries, Caleb Mercer would be in the morgue right now instead of the ICU. But he thought about what happened the last time he stood up against hospital administration. He thought about the cost. And something inside him, something he wasn't proud of, pulled back. I understand the concern, he said quietly. But the surgical decision was mine. I accept full responsibility for that. It wasn't a betrayal. Not exactly. But it wasn't a defense either. It was the careful, measured language of a man protecting himself while trying not to completely abandon someone else. Patricia nodded. Good. I'll handle the staffing issue. Staffing issue. That's what Rachel was now. A staffing issue. Rachel was called to Patricia's office at 9:15. She walked in already knowing. Not because anyone told her, but because she'd felt this before. The quiet machinery of a system deciding you're easier to remove than to defend. She'd felt it in the military. She'd felt it in the years after. And she felt it now, walking down that fourth-floor hallway with her scrubs still carrying the faint smell of surgical antiseptic and a man's blood. Patricia didn't waste time. Nurse Donovan, after reviewing the events of last night, the hospital has determined that your involvement in the surgical procedure on the military patient constituted a breach of clinical protocol and unauthorized participation beyond the scope of your role. Rachel stood still. Effective immediately, your employment at Mercy Lane General is terminated. The words landed like stones dropped into still water. No splash. Just wait. Rachel looked at Patricia for a long moment. She didn't yell. She didn't argue. She didn't beg. She had learned a long time ago that systems like this don't reverse their decisions because you raise your voice. They just use your volume against you later. She reached down and unclipped the badge from her chest. She held it in her hand for a second, felt the weight of it, the smooth plastic, the small photo of herself that never quite looked like her. Then she set it on the edge of Patricia's desk. His name is Caleb, Rachel said quietly. Staff Sergeant Caleb Mercer. In case you were wondering. Patricia didn't respond. Rachel walked out. She passed through the hallway with her head straight and her shoulders level. She carried nothing, no box, no bag. Just herself and the ghost of a badge that wasn't there anymore. Owen saw her from the far end of the corridor. He was standing near the nurse's station, a chart in his hand that he'd stopped reading mid-sentence. He watched her walk toward the elevator. Her steps were even. Her face was still, but there was something in the way she moved, something barely visible, that looked like a woman holding herself together with everything she had left. Owen took a step forward. Then he stopped. His mouth opened slightly, like a word was forming, something that might have mattered, something that might have changed the shape of this moment. But the word didn't come. It sat somewhere between his chest and his throat, trapped behind the same wall he'd been building for years. Rachel stepped into the elevator. The doors closed. She was gone. Owen stood there. The chart in his hand trembled once. He set it down on the counter and pressed both palms flat against the surface. He said nothing. And that silence, that awful, cowardly, human silence, would follow him for days. Rachel drove home in the gray morning light. The streets were wet. The windshield wipers dragged across the glass in a rhythm that sounded too much like a heartbeat. She parked outside her apartment building but didn't get out. She just sat there with the engine off and her hands still on the wheel, staring at nothing. When she finally went inside, she didn't turn on the lights. She sat on the edge of her bed, still in her scrubs, still smelling like the operating room. She looked down at her chest, at the small rectangular outline where her badge had been clipped for 3 years. The fabric was slightly faded there, pressed flat from the weight of something that was no longer present. She placed her palm over it, pressed down gently. This was the second time. The second time she had given everything she had to save someone, followed every instinct her training had carved into her, done exactly what she was built to do. And the system had looked at her and said, "You don't belong here." The first time was the military. The discharge. The quiet, clinical removal of a woman who had earned her place in blood and sweat and sleepless nights in the desert. And now this. Rachel didn't cry. She sat very still. She breathed in slow. And she let the silence fill the room the way water fills a hole, steady, cold, and complete. On the shelf across the room, the folded flag sat in its case. The combat medic patch hung on the corkboard. And the photograph, the one she kept face down, waited in the dark like a question she still couldn't answer. The next morning, Rachel woke up on top of her covers, still in her scrubs. She hadn't meant to fall asleep. She'd sat on the edge of the bed with her palm pressed against the empty space where her badge used to be, and at some point her body had simply given out. Not peacefully, not gently. The way a candle doesn't blow out, it just runs out of wick. The apartment was quiet. Gray light pushed through the blinds in thin, lazy strips. The coffee she'd poured the night before still sat on the kitchen counter, untouched, cold, waiting for someone who never came back for it. Rachel stood slowly. Her reflection caught in the bathroom mirror, tired eyes, creased scrubs, a face that looked 10 years older than it had 48 hours ago. She turned the faucet on, splashed cold water against her skin, and stood there dripping, staring at herself like she was trying to remember who she was outside of a hospital. Outside of a uniform, outside of being needed. She was halfway through changing into clean clothes when she heard it. Engines. Low and heavy. The kind of sound that doesn't belong on a quiet residential street at 8 in the morning. She moved to the window and pulled the blinds back. 3 black SUVs were parked outside her apartment building. Military plates. Tinted windows. The same kind of vehicles she'd seen pull into the hospital bay 2 nights ago. Her chest tightened. The doors opened. 2 Marines in dress uniforms stepped out first, young, squared away, moving with the kind of discipline that's trained into your bones long before it shows in your posture. Behind them, leaning slightly on a cane but refusing to let anyone hold his arm, was a man Rachel recognized instantly. Staff Sergeant Caleb Mercer. He was bandaged. His left arm was in a sling. His face was drawn and pale, the kind of pale that comes from blood loss and nights spent fighting for your own heartbeat. But he was standing, upright, breathing, alive. Beside him stood a younger Marine, compact, alert, with a quiet intensity in his eyes. Corporal Lucas Bennett. And behind them both, stepping out of the lead vehicle with the kind of authority that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need to, was a man in full decorated uniform. Silver hair, square jaw, a chest full of ribbons that told the story of a career most people couldn't survive. Lieutenant General Scott Brennan. Rachel opened her front door before they reached it. She stood in the doorway in a plain t-shirt and jeans, barefoot, hair still damp. She looked nothing like the woman who had spent 6 hours pulling fragments out of a dying Marine's body. But the moment Caleb saw her, he stopped walking. He straightened himself, slowly, painfully, with the kind of effort that costs more than anyone watching could understand. Lucas stepped aside. The general stood still. And Caleb Mercer raised his right hand to his brow in a sharp, trembling salute. "Ma'am." His voice was rough, broken at the edges, but clear. Marines don't forget who saves them. Rachel didn't move. She stood there in her doorway, barefoot on cold tile, and felt something crack open inside her that she'd been holding shut for years. Not the gesture itself. She'd seen salutes before. She'd given them. She'd received them in dusty outposts and crowded mess halls and once, memorably, in the back of a helicopter that was taking fire. But this was different. This was someone coming back. In all the years since she'd left the military, since she'd traded combat boots for nursing shoes and tried to build a life in a world that didn't understand what she carried, no one had ever come back for her. Not the Corps. Not the hospitals. Not the people she'd poured herself into saving. They moved on. They recovered. They forgot. But this man drove across the city, bandaged and barely standing, to find her front door. And he saluted. Rachel's eyes burned. Her throat tightened. She pressed her lips together hard enough that her jaw ached, and she blinked. Once, twice, refusing to let the tears fall. Not because she was ashamed of them, but because she wasn't sure she could stop if she started. She nodded. Slowly, respectfully, the way one Marine acknowledges another. "You should be in a hospital bed, Staff Sergeant." Caleb lowered his hand and almost smiled. "Tried that. The food's terrible." Lucas snorted softly behind him. General Brennan stepped forward. He didn't offer a handshake. He didn't smile. He studied Rachel the way a man studies someone he's already made a decision about, not with judgment, but with recognition. "Ms. Donovan, I'm Lieutenant General Scott Brennan. I oversee Joint Medical Operations Command." His voice was deep, even, the kind of voice that fills a room without rising. "I've already requested Mercy Lane General's internal reports, surgical logs, staffing records, and all documentation related to your termination." Rachel blinked. "Sir, I didn't. I'm not asking permission." He said it the way a general says everything, as fact, not request. "Staff Sergeant Mercer is alive because of decisions made in that operating room. I intend to understand exactly what happened. And exactly why the person who helped save him was removed from her position 12 hours later." He paused. Then, quieter, "The Marine Corps takes care of its own, Ms. Donovan. Even the ones who took off the uniform. Rachel didn't trust herself to speak. She nodded again and stepped aside to let them in. 2 days later, Rachel returned to Mercy Lane General. Not as staff, not with a badge. She came because Caleb had asked her to, and because despite everything the hospital had done to her, she couldn't stay away from a patient she'd fought that hard to save. It was the same instinct that had gotten her fired, the inability to walk away from someone who needed her. She couldn't turn it off. She tried. She found Caleb's recovery room on the 3rd floor. He was sitting up slightly, for lines running from both arms, monitors beeping steadily beside him. Lucas sat in a chair by the window, reading a magazine he clearly wasn't interested in. Caleb grinned when she walked in. Document. I'm not a doctor. You were that night. He shifted carefully, wincing. Far as I'm concerned, you outranked everyone in that room. Rachel almost smiled. Almost. She was checking his chart. Old habits, impossible to break, when the door opened behind her. Owen Bradford walked in. He stopped when he saw her. Not dramatically, not with any visible shock. But there was a hitch in his step, a half-second pause that said everything his face was trying not to. Rachel. Dr. Bradford. The formality landed between them like a wall rebuilt overnight. Owen stood near the door holding a tablet with Caleb's latest imaging results, and for a moment neither of them moved. I didn't know you'd be here, Owen said. Caleb asked me to come. Right. Owen nodded slowly. He stepped further into the room, his eyes moving between the monitors and Rachel with the kind of careful avoidance that only happens when someone is trying very hard not to look at the one thing they actually want to see. He reviewed the imaging results out loud: fragment clearance, tissue response, infection markers. His voice was steady and professional. But twice he lost his place. Twice he paused mid-sentence and glanced at Rachel before continuing. When he finished, there was a silence. The kind that fills a room the way smoke does, slowly, until you can't breathe. Rachel, about what happened, Owen started. Don't. She said it gently, not with anger, with something worse, understanding. You don't owe me anything, doctor. You made the call that night. You saved his life. That's what matters. But her eyes said something different. Her eyes said, you were there. You saw what I did. You know the truth. And you let me walk out alone. Owen held her gaze for a beat too long. Then he looked down at his tablet and nodded. I'll check back this afternoon, he said quietly. And he left. The door clicked shut behind him. Caleb waited exactly 3 seconds before turning to Lucas. $10 says there's a story there. Lucas didn't look up from his magazine, but the corner of his mouth lifted. Make it 20. Over the next several days, the hospital became the one place Rachel kept returning to, and the one place she no longer belonged. She had no badge, no access. But Caleb had made it clear to the nursing staff that Rachel Donovan was to be allowed entry to his room at any time, and when a decorated Marine with a lieutenant general in his corner makes a request, hospitals tend to listen. Owen was there every day. Caleb's case was complex: ongoing monitoring, secondary procedures, careful fragment tracking. And because Rachel was there every day too, their paths crossed constantly. They were professional, polite, measured. But the undercurrent was impossible to miss. It showed up in small moments. The kind of moments that don't mean anything on their own, but mean everything when you line them up. Owen handing Rachel a chart, their fingers brushing for half a second before both pulled back too quickly. Rachel reaching for the door to Caleb's room at the exact same moment Owen reached from the other side. Their hands meeting on the handle, a frozen beat, then an awkward step back and a murmured after you that neither of them quite committed to. A conversation about Caleb's blood work that lasted 4 minutes longer than it needed to because neither wanted to be the first to stop talking. A moment in the hallway where Owen said something about a scan result and Rachel corrected him, gently, precisely. And instead of being offended, Owen looked at her the way a man looks at a sunrise he didn't expect to see. They didn't talk about what happened. They didn't talk about the termination, or the silence, or the elevator doors closing between them. They talked about vitals and imaging and recovery timelines, and every word was a carefully constructed bridge over the thing neither of them was ready to name. But Caleb saw it. Lucas saw it. Even the night nurse who came in to change Caleb's 4-bag saw it. Something was building between Rachel Donovan and Owen Bradford. Something that had started in the blue glow of an operating room at 2 in the morning and hadn't stopped growing since. Neither of them was ready for it, but neither of them could stop it. General Brennan didn't make requests. He made movements. And within 72 hours of standing in Rachel's doorway, the full weight of his investigation had landed on Mercy Lane General like a storm nobody saw coming. But it wasn't just the hospital records that surfaced. It was Rachel's military file, the complete record, unredacted. 6 years of service laid out in black ink and official seals. Deployments, commendations, field reports, and one particular entry that changed the way everyone involved understood who Rachel Donovan really was. She wasn't just a combat medic. She was a Silver Star recipient. Helmand Province. 3 years before she ever set foot in a civilian hospital. Rachel's convoy was ambushed during a routine patrol, ID followed by coordinated small arms fire from 3 positions. The lead vehicle was destroyed. Marines were scattered, wounded, pinned down. Communications were severed. Air support was 20 minutes out. Rachel pulled 11 Marines to cover that day. 11. She dragged them through dirt and smoke and gunfire with her bare hands, tourniqueting wounds with torn fabric, keeping airways open with nothing but training and the kind of will that doesn't show up in a textbook. She moved back and forth across that kill zone like the bullets weren't real, like the only thing that existed in the world was the next Marine who needed her. She saved every single one she reached. But there was one she didn't. Corporal Danny Reeves, her closest friend in the unit. The one who always sat next to her in the mess hall. The one who made everyone laugh when the days got too long and the nights got too quiet. He took a round through the chest while covering Rachel's last extraction. By the time she got back to him, his eyes were already fading. He died in her arms. And Rachel had carried that weight every single day since. Owen found out from Caleb. Not from a file. Not from a report. From a conversation in a hospital room where Caleb, propped up against pillows with furlines in both arms, looked at Owen and said, "You know she has a Silver Star, right?" I pulled her name from old unit records. She saved 11 guys in Helmand. Lost her best friend doing it. Owen didn't respond right away. He stood by the window with his hands in his coat pockets, and something shifted behind his eyes. Something heavy settling into a place that had been empty before. He had no idea. He found Rachel that evening sitting alone on a bench outside the hospital chapel. The hallway was dim, quiet, the kind of quiet that only exists in the forgotten corners of a building that never sleeps. Owen sat down beside her. He didn't say anything. He just sat there, hands folded between his knees, staring at the same stretch of floor she was staring at. A full minute passed before Rachel spoke. Danny used to say the worst part of war isn't dying. Her voice was low, steady, but thin, like a wire pulled too tight. It's surviving and wondering why you got to. She paused. I still wonder. Owen turned his head slightly, not to look at her, just to let her know he was listening. Then he spoke. My brother was 24. His voice was quiet, careful, like he was handling something fragile he hadn't taken off the shelf in years. Routine surgery. Appendectomy. The kind of thing that's supposed to take 45 minutes and end with bad hospital food and a week off work. He swallowed. There was a complication. The attending missed it. By the time someone spoke up, it was too late. Rachel looked at him. That's why I became a surgeon, Owen said. Precision. Control. If I'm the one holding the scalpel, then I'm the one responsible. No one else gets to make that mistake. He paused. And that's why I froze when Patricia came at me. Because the last time I challenged authority in a hospital, the last time I tried to fight the system, I lost someone I couldn't get back. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of 2 people sitting side by side with their wounds finally uncovered, breathing the same air, carrying the same question. Is it safe to be seen? They didn't touch. They didn't make promises. They didn't try to fix each other with words that wouldn't hold. But something shifted between them. The wall that had been standing since that first hallway nod, the professional distance, the careful avoidance, the unspoken tension, developed a crack. Not a big one, but enough to let light through. For the first time in years, Rachel felt like someone was sitting next to her who understood what it cost to keep going. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Owen felt like someone had finally seen the thing he'd been hiding and hadn't looked away. If you've ever watched someone get punished for doing the right thing, if you can't stand seeing bullies win, hit that subscribe button right now. Because in this channel, justice always gets the last word. Caleb Mercer was healing the way Marines heal, stubbornly, impatiently, and with absolutely no interest in following doctor's orders. By the end of the week, he was sitting fully upright, arguing with nurses about when he could start walking on his own, and demanding real food instead of whatever the hospital kitchen kept sending up in those sealed plastic trays. His color was coming back. His voice was stronger. And every single time Rachel walked through the door of his recovery room, his face lit up like a kid who just heard the ice cream truck. Document. I'm not a doctor, Caleb. You keep saying that. I keep not caring. Rachel shook her head, but the corner of her mouth betrayed her. Their dynamic had settled into something warm and easy, the kind of bond that forms between people who've shared something most others will never understand. Caleb treated her like family. Not the polite, surface-level kind. The real kind. The kind that teases you and calls you out and makes you feel like you belong somewhere. And without meaning to, Caleb had also become the bridge. He asked about Owen constantly. Where's Bradford? He checked my labs yet? Tell him my shoulder's itching. That means it's healing, right? And whenever Owen was in the room at the same time as Rachel, Caleb would find a reason to send one of them to get something, water, a blanket, a magazine. So the other would have to stay. He wasn't subtle about it. He didn't need to be. One evening, after Rachel's visit, Owen caught her in the hallway. Hey. He said it like he'd been rehearsing it for 20 minutes and still wasn't sure it was the right word. Would you want to grab coffee? There's a diner around the corner. Nothing fancy. Rachel looked at him. She hesitated. Not because she didn't want to go, but because she'd spent so long building walls that the idea of sitting across from someone without one felt dangerous. Sure, she said, quietly, like the word surprised her too. The diner was small. Vinyl booths, fluorescent lighting, a jukebox in the corner that probably hadn't worked since the 90s. They sat across from each other with mugs of coffee that were too hot to drink and started the way two people start when they're afraid of where a real conversation might lead, with safe things. Caleb's recovery. The imaging results. Hospital logistics. But safe didn't last. Owen set his mug down and looked at her. Really looked at her. The way he had across that operating table, but without the masks and the monitors and the life hanging between them. I should have said something, he said. That morning, when Patricia called you in, I knew what you did was right. I knew it. And I stood there and watched you walk out like I didn't. Rachel studied his face. She didn't rush to respond. She let the words sit between them, gave them the weight they deserved. You're saying it now, she said. That counts for something. Owen exhaled. Not a sigh. More like a release. The sound of something heavy being set down after being carried too long. They talked for another hour. About small things at first, then bigger ones. About why Rachel couldn't sleep most nights. About why Owen never left the hospital before midnight. About the strange loneliness of being surrounded by people who need you but don't know you. And at some point, neither of them could pinpoint exactly when, Rachel laughed. It was small, unexpected, something Owen said about a resident who'd fainted during a routine procedure. But the sound of it, light, unguarded, real, surprised them both. Rachel pressed her fingers to her lips like she was trying to catch it. Owen stared at her like he'd just heard a sound he didn't know existed. She hadn't laughed like that in years. They walked back toward the hospital in the cool night air. The street was quiet. Their footsteps fell into an easy rhythm, unhurried, synchronized without trying. Owen stopped beneath a streetlight. The glow caught the edges of his face, softening the sharpness he usually carried like armor. Can I tell you something? He said. Rachel stopped beside him. Yeah. I've spent my whole career trying to be precise enough to never lose anyone again. Every cut, every decision, I measure twice, 3 times, because I'm terrified of the one moment I'm not careful enough. He paused, looked at her. But watching you that night, you don't operate from precision. You operate from faith. You walked into that or believing he'd make it before you had any proof he would. And I think that scares me, because I lost mine a long time ago. The streetlight hummed above them. A car passed somewhere in the distance. Rachel looked at Owen, at the man standing under a pool of light telling her the truest thing he'd ever said out loud. She reached over and took his hand. Not dramatically, not desperately, gently, the way you pick up something fragile that someone else has dropped. She held it for a moment, then let go. Maybe you just need someone to remind you it's still there. Owen looked at his hand, then at her. They parted ways that night without saying anything more. No grand declarations. No promises. Just two people walking in opposite directions with something new and terrifying blooming in the space between them. Something had shifted. They both felt it, and neither of them could undo it, even if they wanted to. Patricia Holloway was not the kind of woman who waited for the fire to reach her. She was the kind who set her own. The internal investigation was closing in. General Brennan's team had already pulled surgical logs, staffing records, and email correspondence from the night of Caleb's surgery. The hospital board was nervous. Lawyers were being consulted. And Patricia, sitting in her pristine office with the walls tightening around her, decided that if she was going down, she would choose who burned first. She called a contact at a local news outlet. Not a journalist with integrity. The kind of contact who trades in angles, not truth. And she gave them a story, but not the real one. The version Patricia fed to the press painted Rachel Donovan as a rogue nurse who had overstepped her authority during a high-risk military surgery. A woman who had inserted herself into a procedure she had no business being part of, manipulated a surgeon into making a reckless decision, and endangered the life of a critically wounded service member. The story described Rachel as unstable, a former military medic who couldn't separate her past from her present, who acted on impulse rather than protocol, and who had been rightfully terminated to protect patient safety. It was a lie, every word of it. But lies don't need to be true to do damage. They just need to be first. The story hit that evening. By the next morning, it was everywhere. Rachel's phone started ringing before sunrise. Numbers she didn't recognize. Reporters looking for comments. Former colleagues texting carefully worded messages that said nothing and meant less. One by one, the people she had worked alongside for 3 years began to pull away. Not because they believed the story, but because being close to it was dangerous. Rachel stopped answering her phone by noon. She sat in her apartment with the curtains drawn and the television off, listening to the silence that comes when the world decides to rewrite you. She didn't read the articles. She didn't need to. She'd lived through enough to know that once a system decides to make you the villain, the truth becomes a footnote no one reads. At Mercy Lane General, the board called an emergency meeting. Owen was summoned. 5 people sat across from him in a windowless conference room. Board members, legal advisors, people whose job it was to protect the hospital's name, not its people. They spoke in careful, rehearsed language. But the message was simple. Distance yourself. Dr. Bradford, given the current media attention, the board believes it's in everyone's best interest for you to clarify your role in the procedure. Specifically, we'd like you to confirm publicly that the surgical decision was yours alone and that Nurse Donovan's involvement was peripheral at best. Owen sat very still. His hands were flat on the table. His jaw was tight. Peripheral, he repeated. That's the language legal has approved. Owen looked at the faces around the table. He thought about the operating room. About Rachel standing across from him for 6 hours, guiding, anticipating, holding steady when everyone else had already given up. Peripheral. The word tasted like poison. But then one of the board members leaned forward. Owen, you remember what happened at St. Andrews, don't you? When you challenged administration over the Patterson case. You lost 2 years of your career. You almost lost your license. A pause. Don't make the same mistake twice. Owen said nothing. The meeting ended. He walked back to his office and closed the door. He called Rachel that evening. The conversation was strained, careful, full of pauses that lasted too long and words that didn't say enough. Owen talked around the edges of what was happening, the board, the pressure, the media, without ever landing on the thing Rachel needed to hear. She listened, and in his hesitation, she heard everything he wasn't saying. I get it, Owen. Her voice was quiet, not angry, worse, resigned. You've got a career to protect. I've already lost mine. She hung up. Owen sat in his office holding the phone against his ear long after the line went dead. On his desk sat the surgical report from that night. Every page had Rachel's name on it. Her observations, her calls, her instincts. The record was clear. Without her, Caleb Mercer would have died. And Owen knew it. He pressed his palms against his eyes and sat in the dark. Across town, Rachel sat on her bedroom floor with her back against the bed. The apartment was dark. She hadn't turned on a single light since the sun went down. Her phone lay face down on the carpet beside her, still buzzing with calls she would never answer. She reached up to the shelf behind her and, for the first time in over a year, picked up the photograph. Her old unit. 12 faces lined up in desert fatigues, squinting against the Afghan sun. Dusty, tired, grinning. Alive. She scanned the faces one by one until her eyes found the one they always found. Danny Reeves. Third from the left. That stupid crooked smile. Dog tags hanging loose because he never tucked them, and no matter how many times the sergeant yelled at him, he looked like a man who didn't know he had 3 weeks left to live. Rachel traced his face with her thumb. "I'm tired, Danny," she whispered. Her voice cracked for the first time. Not loudly, just enough to break the silence. "I'm so tired of being the one who stays and gets left behind." The photograph trembled in her hands. She held it against her chest and closed her eyes. Outside, the city moved on. Cars passed. Lights blinked. The world kept spinning like it always does when someone is quietly falling apart in a room where nobody can see. Owen didn't sleep that night. He lay on his back in the dark, staring at a ceiling he couldn't see, and replayed every moment like a film he couldn't stop rewinding. The operating room. Rachel standing across from him, steady as stone, calling out fragment positions before the monitors even caught up. The way she moved, not with hesitation, not with ego, but with the quiet certainty of someone who had already decided this man was going to live. The hallway. Her walking toward the elevator with no box, no bag, just the empty space on her chest where a badge used to be. And him, standing there, watching, saying nothing. The bench outside the chapel. Her voice, low and honest. Danny's name. The weight she carried every day without asking anyone to help hold it. Her hand on his under the streetlight. Warm, brief, gone before he was ready. And the phone call. Her voice, not angry, not bitter, just tired. The kind of tired that comes from being let down so many times you stop expecting anything different. "You've got a career to protect." "I've already lost mine." Owen pressed his palms against his eyes. He thought about his brother, 24 years old. A routine surgery that should have ended with bad food and daytime television. The complication the attending missed. The nurse who noticed something was wrong but didn't speak up because she was afraid of being overruled. The silence in that operating room that cost a young man his life. Owen had spent his entire career running from that silence. He'd become a surgeon so he'd never be the one who missed the sign. He'd built his life around precision and control because those were the only things that stood between him and the kind of loss that breaks a person in half. But right now, lying in the dark, staring at nothing, he realized the truth he'd been avoiding for days. He wasn't becoming the surgeon who missed the sign. He was becoming the one who stayed quiet. The same silence that killed his brother was the silence he was choosing right now. And if he walked into that boardroom tomorrow and said what they wanted him to say, that Rachel's role was peripheral, that she didn't matter, that her presence in that operating room was a liability instead of the reason a man was still breathing, then he would be the doctor he had spent his whole life trying not to become. Owen sat up in the dark, and he made his choice. The next morning, Owen walked into the board meeting at Mercy Lane General 15 minutes early. He was clean-shaven. His coat was pressed. His hands were steady. He carried a folder under his arm, the full surgical timeline from the night of Caleb Mercer's operation. The board members were already seated. Patricia Holloway sat at the far end of the table, composed, confident, waiting for Owen to deliver the statement they'd prepared for him. He didn't. Owen opened the folder and laid the documents across the table one by one. Surgical logs, imaging timestamps, fragment extraction records, vital sign progression. Every page told the same story, and Rachel Donovan's name was on all of them. Staff Sergeant Caleb Mercer arrived at this hospital with 53 bullet fragments in his body and a less than 10% chance of surviving the night, Owen said. His voice was calm, clear, the steadiest it had been in weeks. The senior attending recommended stabilization. Multiple staff members stepped back. The consensus in that room was to wait, and waiting would have killed him. He paused, looked at every face around the table. Rachel Donovan is the reason he's alive. She identified the surgical window. She guided the extraction with combat-trained instincts that no one else in this building possesses. Without her, I would not have attempted the procedure. Without her, Staff Sergeant Mercer would be dead. Patricia opened her mouth. Owen didn't let her speak. If telling the truth costs me my position, then this isn't a place worth working. The room went silent. The kind of silence that doesn't feel empty. It feels like something cracking open. Owen closed the folder and walked out. That same morning, 300 miles away, Lieutenant General Scott Brennan released his findings. The report landed on the desks of military and civilian medical review boards simultaneously. It was thorough, decisive, and left no room for interpretation. Rachel Donovan had acted within the bounds of emergency medical judgment. Her combat training, her assessment of the patient's condition, and her participation in the procedure were not only justified. They were instrumental. The report concluded that without her intervention, the surgical team would not have attempted the operation and the patient would not have survived. The media picked it up within hours. The same outlets that had run Patricia's distorted version of events now scrambled to correct the record. New headlines appeared, not about a rogue nurse, but about a decorated combat veteran who saved a Marine's life and was fired for it. Public support didn't just return. It exploded. Social media lit up. Veterans organizations issued statements. Former Marines who had served with Rachel came forward with stories of their own. The narrative didn't just flip. It shattered and rebuilt itself around the truth. Patricia Holloway's version collapsed, and the woman who had spent days sitting in a dark apartment, holding a photograph and wondering if the world would ever see her clearly, had no idea what was already on its way. Owen drove to Rachel's apartment that evening. He didn't rehearse anything in the car. He didn't plan a speech. He just drove, through streets still damp from last night's rain, past the hospital, past the diner where she'd laughed for the first time in years, past the streetlight where she'd held his hand and told him his faith was still there. He parked. He walked to her door. He knocked. Rachel opened it slowly. She was in the same clothes she'd been in that morning. Her eyes were tired. Her hair was loose. She looked at Owen the way a person looks at someone they're not sure they should trust again. Owen stood in her doorway. No folder. No charts. No professional armor. Just a man standing where he should have been standing days ago. "I should have walked out with you that morning," he said. His voice was quiet, unsteady in a way she'd never heard before. "When they took your badge and you walked to that elevator, I should have been right beside you. I knew what you did was right. I knew it, and I let you leave alone because I was afraid." He paused. "I'm sorry it took me this long." Rachel looked at him. She didn't respond immediately. She studied his face, the tension in his jaw, the rawness in his eyes, the way his hands hung at his sides like a man who had finally stopped trying to hold everything together. A long beat passed. The hallway was quiet. Somewhere outside, a car door closed. "You're here now," she said, and she stepped aside to let him in. The investigation into Patricia Holloway concluded on a Tuesday. There was no dramatic courtroom scene, no public shouting match, no moment where she broke down and confessed. It ended the way most institutional reckonings end, quietly, clinically, behind closed doors, with paperwork and signatures, and the slow, grinding machinery of accountability finally catching up to someone who thought she was above it. The findings were unanimous. Patricia Holloway had prioritized administrative control over patient welfare. She had terminated a qualified medical professional not because of a genuine protocol violation, but because Rachel's actions exposed a culture of institutional caution that Patricia had built and fiercely protected. She had then compounded that decision by leaking a deliberately distorted account to the press in an attempt to discredit Rachel and shield the hospital from scrutiny. The board removed her effective immediately. No severance negotiation. No quiet resignation dressed up as a mutual decision. She was escorted from the building the same way Rachel had been, without ceremony, without acknowledgement, without anyone in the hallway stopping to say goodbye. The hospital issued a public apology 3 days later. It was carefully worded, reviewed by lawyers, and read by the new interim administrator at a press conference that lasted less than 10 minutes. It acknowledged that Rachel Donovan had been wrongfully terminated. It stated that her actions during the emergency surgery on Staff Sergeant Caleb Mercer were not only justified but exemplary. And it expressed regret, though not nearly enough of it, for the harm caused. Rachel didn't watch the press conference. She didn't need to. She was sitting in her kitchen when her phone rang. She almost didn't answer. Weeks of reporters and strangers and block numbers had trained her to let it go to voicemail. But something made her pick up. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, and direct. Ms. Donovan, this is Colonel James Whitfield calling from the National Military Medical Center. I'm reaching out on behalf of our executive leadership team. We've reviewed your service record, your combat commendations, and the full case file from the Mercer operation. A pause. We'd like to offer you the position of Director of Emergency Trauma Operations. Rachel sat very still. Director, she repeated. Yes, ma'am. Full authority over emergency trauma protocols, staff training, and field-to-hospital integration. We've been looking for someone with exactly your combination of combat medical experience and civilian clinical skill. Frankly, Ms. Donovan, your record speaks for itself. But what you did for Staff Sergeant Mercer, that confirmed what we already suspected. You're the person we need leading this department. Rachel pressed her hand flat against the kitchen counter, the same counter where she'd stood weeks ago, staring at the rain, holding coffee she never drank, waiting for a shift alert from a hospital that would fire her before sunrise. When do you need an answer? She asked. Take whatever time you need. But we hope it's yes. She hung up. She looked at the folded flag on her shelf, at the combat medic patch on the corkboard, at the photograph, still sitting face up on the shelf where she'd left it the night everything fell apart. Danny Reeves grinned back at her. Third from the left. Dog tags loose. That stupid, beautiful, crooked smile. Rachel smiled back. I think I finally know why I got to stay, Danny. She visited Caleb the next day. He was being transferred to a military rehabilitation facility. Somewhere with better equipment, better staff, and the kind of long-term care that would get him back on his feet. When Rachel walked into his room, he was sitting fully upright for the first time since the surgery. His sling was off. His color was back. He looked like a man who had stared death in the face and told it to wait. He grinned when he saw her. Document. Still not a doctor, Caleb. Still don't care. Rachel stood at the foot of his bed. She looked at him, really looked at him, and felt the full weight of what they'd been through settle into something she could finally carry without it breaking her. You came back for me, she said. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were wet. That morning, when you showed up at my door, you could barely stand, and you drove across the city to find me. She paused. Nobody's ever done that. Caleb looked at her. His grin softened into something quieter, something real. That's what we do. Document Marines don't leave anyone behind. He shrugged, carefully, because his shoulders still ached. You taught me that, whether you remember it or not. Rachel stepped forward. She straightened her posture, squared her shoulders, and for the first time since she'd taken off the uniform, she raised her hand in a sharp, steady salute. Caleb's eyes glistened. He returned it without hesitation. They held it for a long moment. Two people who had saved each other in different ways, saying everything that mattered without a single word. Then Rachel lowered her hand, squeezed his arm, and walked out. Lucas, sitting in his usual chair by the window, looked at Caleb after she left. You ever gonna stop calling her Doc? Caleb smiled. Not a chance. Rachel arrived at the National Military Medical Center on a Monday morning. The building was enormous, glass and steel and purpose, the kind of facility that existed because people believed saving lives was worth building something permanent around. The American flag hung from the front entrance, catching the early wind, and mounted above the main doors, carved into stone and polished until it gleamed, was the Marine Corps emblem. Rachel stood on the sidewalk looking up at it. She hadn't expected it to hit her this hard, but it did. The eagle, the globe, the anchor, symbols she had worn on her shoulder in places where the sand burned and the nights were long, and the only thing keeping you alive was the person beside you. She took a breath, straightened her blazer, adjusted the new ID badge clipped to her chest, Director of Emergency Trauma Operations. Then she heard footsteps behind her. She turned. Owen Bradford stood on the sidewalk in a white coat she'd never seen before. New credentials hung from his pocket. A lanyard around his neck bore the medical center's emblem, the same one carved above the doors. Rachel stared at him. What are you doing here? Owen smiled. Not the careful, measured smile she was used to. A real one. The kind that reaches the eyes and doesn't apologize for being there. I transferred, he said. Surgical team. Started processing the paperwork the same week I walked out of that board meeting. Rachel shook her head slowly. You followed me. Owen took a step closer. Someone once told me I just needed someone to remind me my faith was still there. He paused. looked at her with the same expression he'd had across the operating table, steady, certain, present. I figured I should stay close to that person. Rachel looked at him, at this man who had been afraid and had chosen courage anyway, who had been silent and had finally spoken, who had let her walk away once and then spent every day since making sure he never did it again. She didn't say anything. She took his hand, not briefly this time, not the way she had under the streetlight, gentle and fleeting, like something borrowed. This time she held it, and he held hers back. They turned toward the entrance together. The marine emblem above the doors caught the morning light. Rachel looked up at it one last time. Then she walked through the doors, Owen beside her, the emblem behind them. She didn't look back. They took her badge. But life gave her something bigger. Not just a title, not just a career, but someone who finally chose to stay. If this story moved you, if you believe that doing the right thing should never go unrewarded, share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. And drop a comment. What would you have done in Rachel's place? We read every single one.